Ladies, gentlemen, and walking cannons of all ages, with the recent addition of Title Update 5 to Sunbreak, we really got some incredible improvements to our ability to make builds and sets in the game. Of course, many weapons work in pretty standard ways, and so their new builds will be pretty similar, going for pure attack and affinity as far as their offensive builds go at least. But Gunlance? Well, Gunlance has a lot more options than that. Of course, there are Gunlance builds that focus more on the weapon hits themselves, but one of my favorite concepts in the game as a whole is builds that focus on shelling. I love any weapon that has a way to deal damage in a sort of non-standard way, and shelling is arguably the biggest example of this, as it isn't affected by attack or affinity or even the vast majority of skills. And what this lets you do is play with irregular skills, things that most quote-unquote meta builds, most builds built for pure offense, simply don't get to use, and in a weird way they increase the damage of the shelling build while also leaving you with a ton of room for utility or defensive skills while doing an insane amount of damage anyways, just because of the way that shelling damage works. Generally, I've been a big fan of Gunlance for ages, but my favorite time to play Gunlance in a Monster Hunter game as a whole is near the end of the life cycle of said game, when builds start to have tons of space, because that's when Gunlance gets sort of silly, letting it reach absolute massive heights of damage, similar to most other weapons getting, but with just so much extra space for build customization and utility that the other weapons don't have the space for with the same damage levels. Today we're going to be doing a shelling-based Gunlance build, with a very specific one at that. Today it's all about Bullet Barrage, an incredible silk bind available to Gunlance that unloads all of your shells, your wyvern fire, and your worm stake all at the same time, all in one go, while also having a decent amount of hyper armor on the attack itself, letting you tank things like roars or smaller attacks while you do the wind up yourself. While this attack has always been really fun to use, it's been really hard to say that you should build around it as the sole use of the weapon, as it's a silk bind. It costs 2 wire bugs, and the recharge just isn't fast enough for you to just purely spam it. Well, at least it wasn't before Title Update 5 at least. Now things are different, mostly due to the new skill Frenzied Bloodlust from Risen Shagaru Magala armor. This gives you a bonus wire bug for up to 90 seconds depending on skill level after you've successfully cleared Frenzy debuff. This stacks on top of the usual extra wire bugs that you can get either around maps or from the Sumyoun Endemic Life Palico skill, which I absolutely recommend using in any build that wants to use silk binds, and this lets you have 4 wire bugs at the same time. 4 wire bugs is crazy, mainly because of the way that the recharges work. When you use a silk bind that costs 2 wire bugs, the second wire bug won't start recharging until the first one finishes, which means that it takes ages before you can use a 2-cost silk bind again. If you have 4 wire bugs, this lets you rotate which wire bug is that second one, letting you only have 1 wire bug waiting unchargeable, and you're just rotating wire bugs, letting you use your 2-cost silk binds way more often than you would otherwise be able to. On top of this, we pair this with the Wind Mantle skill from Risen Kashala Deora armor, which increases wire bug recovery speed when you use silk bind attacks. Both of these skills reset super quickly when you sheathe, and so this build is also built around the concept of not sheathing your weapon, which Gunlance is already quite capable of doing with its basic kit. There are a couple of variations on this build that you can bring for different situations, but honestly that's how I describe Gunlance as a whole. The skills that affect damage are sort of set, and then there are a ton of utility options that we use on top of that that are a bit more situational. That said, let's dive in a little bit to our actual equipment then. First up, of course, is the weapon itself, and this is the Amatsu Gunlance for some pretty obvious reasons. Shelling damage doesn't care about attack or affinity. The only real thing that an average weapon provides to decide your shelling damage is the shelling level stat and shelling type. Amatsu Gunlance is long, which most people will say is the best type for Bullet Barrage, as the combined damage of the different parts seem to average out the highest on long shelling, and while by default this Gunlance is shelling level 7, we can use Curio augments to make it the maximum of shelling level 8. Past that, there is one special reason to use this Gunlance for this situation, and that is because it has a unique, somewhat hidden effect of boosting the damage of all silk binds that you use while wielding the weapon by 10%. With that said, our augments for the weapon are the shelling level upgrade, of course, then we just dump the rest into sharpness, as it's the only stat that has any effect at all on us really, then the final slot just goes into element because it's the only thing that fits in one slot, and I like having all the slots filled. Past that, we should talk about switch skills, which are pretty set in stone for this build. For the first slot, we want charged shelling. This is pretty important as a part of your kit. You can pretty much spam Bullet Barrage when you have 4 wire bugs, but aside from that, there are some occasions where you just won't be able to use the skill. In those situations, charged shelling is your best damage per second over a long period of downtime, but just rapid firing is the best in short openings, so it requires a little bit of thought as to the length of the opening provided. Quick reload for sure in the second slot, Wormstake Cannon in the third slot. Erupting Cannon isn't bad, but Wormstake does more damage in Bullet Barrage unless you're hitting a really bad hit zone, which you probably shouldn't be anyways. Then of course in the fourth slot we have Bullet Barrage, and you may be wondering if we use Ground Splitter on the other scroll, and the answer is just no, we don't. Ground Splitter uses 1 wire bug to increase your shelling damage by 20% for a period of time afterwards, but it is a super slow recharge wire bug, so it essentially just locks up a wire bug for its entire duration, meaning that you just can't hit bullet barrages often, and this costs you more than 20% damage, so it just isn't worth it. On top of that, this build focuses a lot on using switch skill swap defensively, so there's a big benefit to having both scrolls be identical. Then in our last slot, it doesn't really matter much, but I've got Reverse Blast chosen here. As for our Talisman of the Day, I got a really solid one, but I should mention this isn't unachievable by any means. It's not quite a perfect roll, but it is really solid. It's 3 sneak attack, 2 artillery, and 2 2-slots. It is perfect for this build, and a similar value talisman is very capable of being found, as you can focus the sneak attack skill through the new Cyclist Meld option, and so you can definitely get yourself a similar value one within this build without it taking like a year of melding. If your talisman is a little bit lesser than this, just cut out a bit of the utility and you won't have much of a massive loss. That said, the armor that we're using today is the Risen Kushala helmet, the Amatsu chest piece, and then the Risen Shagaru arms, waist, and legs. In the slots we want to put in the relevant anti-species rampage decoration for the weapon, then you want 1 magazine plus jewel, 1 jumping plus jewel, and 1 regular jumping jewel, 1 razor plus jewel and 1 regular razor jewel, 1 medicine plus jewel and 1 regular medicine jewel, 2 redirection jewels, 1 breath jewel, 3 iron shell jewels, and then for solo play 1 intrepid jewel, or in multiplayer 1 shock absorber jewel, so you just don't mess up your hunting partners, which you absolutely would without it in this build. As for your armor augments, you want to fill up the 2 mantle skills. You want 2 ranks of wind mantle from your augments and 3 ranks of powder mantle. That's 1 skill per armor piece, and a few of these pieces even have good sacrificial skills that you can afford to lose using the augment skills plus option, as Bloodlust itself doesn't provide us any damage, so as long as you have 1 rank of Bloodlust still around to apply the frenzy, you're good. I've also lost the strife from my legs. It doesn't do anything for the build to have it, so it is just nice to have it off my skill list for cleanliness. All of that said, our final skill list here is 3 attack boost, 3 artillery for a 30% boost to our shelling damage, 3 recovery up, 3 evade extender, 3 Kushala blessing for super recovery, which is just slow health regen over time, 3 wirebug whisper to let us hold on to extra wirebugs even longer, 3 sneak attack is one of the only skills that affects shelling damage for a 20% boost when hitting the side or back of a monster, which isn't going to be all the time, at least not in solo play, but it is pretty consistent. Then we have 3 wind mantle, 3 powder mantle, which actually builds up over the course of pretty much just a couple of bullet barrages at this level, so it's just a bonus hefty explosion very frequently. Then we have 3 frenzied bloodlust, 2 weakness exploit, 2 load shells for 1 extra shell capacity, 2 redirection gives us a lovely parry on demand, 1 bloodlust lets us have the frenzy applied to us frequently to allow us to activate frenzied bloodlust, and it's worth noting that it only takes 1 or 2 bullet barrages to actually clear frenzy, so it's super quick and really consistent to do. Then we have 1 quick breath. This clears most debuffs when you do a switch skill swap and also recovers health if it clears anything. This synergizes nicely with our redirection as well, as it uses the same function. Then finally 1 level of Heaven Sent. This gives you a buff if you avoid being flinched massively that decreases the damage of the next hit that you take, reduces stamina consumption, and also gives us another switch skill swap bonus, making it recover sharpness. It says that it makes it reload ammo, but that only applies to ranged weapons, not to gunlance shells. Still, the sharpness is really nice. All of this said, there are a couple of other configurations to this. Razor Sharp is in the build because the sharpness consumption of Bullet Barrage is nasty. However, unlike most weapons, gunlance shells, and specifically every part of Bullet Barrage itself, only lose damage once you hit orange sharpness, so you rarely have to sharpen even then. Razor Sharp makes this take longer to reach, but it could also be called a superfluous skill. Arguably, you could replace this with Speed Sharpening, which would only be 1 4-slot, and then you still have a 2-slot to spare. As well, if you can find the space, I'd say getting stun resistance is a pretty big deal. Bullet Barrage has hyper armor, but if you get stunned while it's launching off, that just sort of sucks really. Then an alternative is to try and find the space for Bloodright for even more tankiness instead of some of our damage skills, but that's a personal choice really. It depends if you want to focus survivability or more damage. Personally, I find if you run solo with 2 healing Palicos and the Kushala Blessing with recovery up, it does the job pretty damn well. On top of this, we have our dongo options, which do actually matter for Gunlance. For your level 4 dongo, I'd recommend either dongo shifter for a nice health recovery every time you swap switch skill scrolls, or super recovery dongo, which is just essentially a second Kushala Blessing effect that does stack. For your level 3, you want Bombardier. This boosts the damage of shelling attacks a fair amount, as well as Wyvern Fire. You don't need this at level 4 because the level 4 only makes shelling attacks have a small chance of not consuming sharpness. It doesn't increase the damage any further. Then the level 1 dongo is entirely personal choice based on the situation. Normally this is when I do the math for the build to show you the effective raw, but the effective raw of this just doesn't really matter. So instead I'll just line out some of the core synergies of this build and how they affect us. Of course, as far as damage goes, our shelling damage and bullet barrage damage are being buffed 10% by the Amatsu weapon effect, 30% by artillery, 20% by sneak attack when it applies. Bullet barrage is buffed by about 15% for having the extra shell from load shells, and that totals out at 75% increased damage to bullet barrage, which is actually quite impressive for something not affected by your average attack increases. On top of that, we have our switch skill swap helps of Redirection, Heaven Sent, and Quick Breath to make swapping switch skill scrolls, clear our debuffs, heal us if it does, counter any attack that hits you while it's happening, and also recover some sharpness. Then of course, all of our recovery skills we've got going on. This all works together just beautifully, and it's just plain fun to press Bullet Barrage nearly unendingly. Nothing really being able to stop you. I love playing this build, and it has definitely worked its way into my regular rotation of builds that I play, so I hope you'll all enjoy this as well. That's about it then for today. Let us know any other weapons or build concepts that you'd like to see us expand upon in the future, as there are just so many things for us to mess with in Title Update 5, and this will help us decide what to do first. Like if you like the video, subscribe and hit the notification bell for more, and most importantly, ladies and gentlemen, until next time, stay sweet.
Josh, Cotton, and Hollow with the videos, dropping the humor like a hammer on your tippy toes, bringing entertainment on a daily arrangement to take our insanity and turn it into entertainment. Yes, I said entertainment twice, to reiterate that it is nice to look into your faces on a mostly daily basis when you let us in your homes to make the whole world a stage. Goodbye.